Hello, BookTube. As you can see, I'm here once again with my friend Zach from the Brattle Bookshop here in Boston.
Hello again.
And we are met today to discuss a momentous subject, a subject close to our hearts. That is the Dutch humanist Erasmus.
You know, he actually is one of my favorites, Steve.
No, I'm afraid once again, we are discussing baseball, America's pastime.
Yeah, emphasis on past.
And last time we talked mostly about the effect of sabermetrics on baseball.
And analytics in general.
Analytics in general. Well, how it changes the sport if you start crunching numbers instead of going with gut instinct? Some sort of
gut instinct.
Romantic idea?
Yeah, experience, sort of tradition, I think is a big part of it.
So where once upon a time, for a century, the question would have been, what is our most experienced scout's gut telling him? Suddenly it became, what is the mathematical valence for our most experienced scout's gut? How often is his gut right?
Yeah, and that with scouting and also with current players and how to evaluate players that you have or evaluate players for a trade. It's how do these traditional metrics, the ones everyone knows, batting average, runs batted in, pitcher wins, ERA, how do these value players as opposed to the metrics that are used now and are a lot more useful, quite frankly, than the old metrics.
Now, would I be right in hearing just the slightest tone of resentment when you allow that some of those calculations are frankly useful?
Oh, they're extremely useful because.
But is there a part of Zach that doesn't like them?
There's a part of me that doesn't like how they're used, or the extent to which they're relied upon, I guess is the best way to say it. But there is no question that that things like traditional batting average and slugging percentage, for instance, there are big gaping holes in how they evaluate the value of a batter. And the
how would that be? How would it be that statistics that evaluate how well a batter bats leave out large parts of evaluating a batter?
Sure. Well, it goes. You almost have to go back to first principles. How does a batter create value? Well, a batter creates value by creating or contributing to runs scored. Traditional batting average, it gives you a number that tells you kind of the contribution of a batter to runs scored, but it does so in sort of a roundabout way. It tells you how often that batter gets a safe hit, which is telling you how often he reaches base. It doesn't tell you how many bases, if it's a double, if it's a single, if it's a home run. It also has a blind spot for other ways batters can get on base, namely walks, reaching on an error, getting hit by a pitch. Something like on base percentage does a better job with that because that includes ways of getting on base other than hits. Slugging percentage, which is another traditional statistic, does a better job of telling you about a batter's power, whether you get a higher slugging percentage depending on how many bases you reach. So a triple will give you a higher average than a single, for instance. But the new metrics, but you're still only there. You're really only telling me how many bases the batter has reached. You're not telling me how many runs he's scored. So really, you're measuring the wrong thing. You're measuring a related thing. Certainly, how many times the batter gets on base and how many bases he reaches per plate appearance, you're giving useful information, but it's not really the best information. Statistics now can give you a much better idea of how efficiently a batter creates runs, by measuring things that are slightly different.
And in the days before the rise of statistics, were there gaps on the other side as well? Intangibles that shouldn't have been factored in, like the ball club management's relationship with the player, or the player's reputation, or the player's promises, the player promised things?
I think there were at times, more weight than should have been given to those sort of, for lack of a better term, intangible, interpersonal, more gut instinct, I guess, evaluations. But that isn't to say that there's no place for those. Yeah, I think there's a very important place for those, as long as they're balanced against the hard data, which we really do have now.
I don't think there's an American sport that's more stewed in with the whole concept of intangibles than baseball. I have never heard a basketball fan talk about basketball in the misty-eyed way that I've heard baseball fans talk about baseball.
They do, and I think maybe not with the average fan. I guess I think a much higher percentage of baseball fans will talk about their team in particular in that way. But basketball, I think more attention is being paid, not to start talking about basketball, but if you think about a basketball team, team cohesion is enormously important in basketball in ways that it never has or will be in baseball, just the way the game is played.
Yeah, all that movement.
All that movement that has to be coordinated. You can't get the ball unless your teammate passes you the ball.
Yeah.
You can imagine that. You can imagine the personality clashes possible, with that simple fact.
When I was sit in the stands for Iowa Hawkeyes basketball games, I didn't have to imagine personality clashes. I could hear them from 60 rows back. I could hear the elbow hitting someone's shoulder in a way that would have completely returned me to my subatomic state. No, it wasn't a love tap, is what I'm saying. But our conversation today, part of our conversation today is going to, we talked last time about how all of these analytics have changed the geography of the game. But you have another change in mind for today, another change that isn't, or is it, particularly connected with
it is intimately connected.
Okay.
However, not nearly as visible, I'd say, in terms of watching a game, as something like the higher amount of strikeouts, or the fact that games last a lot longer. Those are immediately apparent to anyone who watches a game.
But the element we're thinking about is management.
Is specifically the field manager. For now, you're an American, Steve. When someone says baseball manager, does a picture come to your mind?
Yes.
Of what a baseball manager looks like?
Yes. Very much.
Give me a few characteristics that pop into your mind.
George Costanza's characterizations of Steinbrenner.
Oh, well, see, but he was the owner, the team.
But he
owner.
acted like, I think, of a manager.
Well, he did, and what's interesting, and that's a great entry point to this. He was the owner. He was sort of upper management. He wasn't the manager, which is sort of baseball shorthand for the field manager, the manager who deals with the day-to-day strategic, tactical.
In the case of the field manager, then the very first thing that comes to mind is there's no crying in baseball.
Tom Hanks. There you go. Does that character strike you as much of a number cruncher? Does that character strike you as someone who is particularly open to input from others about how he conducts himself in his job?
No, that character always strikes me, at least in the popular characterization, as the typical idea of the gone to see athletic coach for a high school?
Mhm.
The guy who in fifth period has to teach algebra and doesn't know how to do it at all.
And doesn't, yes.
The guy who will tell his students in biology that if they have the flu, they should run it off. That sort of
Yeah.
thing comes to mind.
Yeah.
That's what I think of when I think of those people.
Yeah.
And
And
they
that's
held sway for a long time, right? They
for
had the power of God on
the
earth.
most of the history of baseball. They were almost always former players who were more or less journeymen. Who were, it was very unusual that a star player would become a manager, although not unheard of.
Didn't
But
Babe Ruth
usually
want to be?
he did. He absolutely did, and no one would give him a job for reasons that were, well, for a lot of reasons, most particular to the character of Babe Ruth. But yeah, there were lots of people who were sort of would not even be considered for a baseball managerial position.
Why is it? I mean, before we get onto the subject, why is it you think that the journeyman players usually take that role? Is it just because they're always around the clubhouse? Because they know everybody?
Part of it is that. Part of it is they might have gotten into managing. This is one reason they get into managing earlier, because players who aren't as good don't play as long. So they sort of start in. There was a very
certainly glad that's not true for book reviewing.
There's
That'd be a cruel world for book reviewing.
For decades and decades and decades, there was a prescribed path to becoming a baseball manager. You start at the one of the lower level of minor league teams in an organization, and you sort of work your way up. And it can take decades to do that.
For listeners, what was that old concept of a baseball manager? What is a field manager in the, at least, in the prior part of the discussion?
He's the captain. He's the captain of the ship at sea. He makes every decision.
That can't be true.
Absolutely. That is this is sort of the idea. Now,
have you ever been on a ship at sea?
I have never been on a ship.
I didn't think so. The captain can throw someone overboard. The captain is Steinbrenner.
Oh, so managers could absolutely, the equivalent of throwing someone overboard, send them down to the minors.
Are you telling me that's true?
Yes,
like, for instance, the 1940s, a Major League Baseball manager could break a player just because he wanted to without consulting management?
Absolutely.
Oh my God.
Management might put its foot down and ultimately win, but a manager would absolutely assume that prerogative. He might be proven wrong, but that's something that a manager felt was within his portfolio.
So these early, the managers that you're talking about, the ones that shaped the game, had unbelievable amounts of power.
Yes. But we're not even talking about the 40s. We're talking about managers into the, I'd say even 80s and 90s could be terribly influential, not just about what happened on the field, but player personnel decisions. One interesting part, it's always useful, I think, in these conversations to go back to Moneyball, the book or the film, and in particular, one sort of conflict that they did a good job of portraying in the film was the conflict between Brad Pitt's character, who played Billy Beane, the general manager, so sort of the front office manager, and Art Howe, who was played by Philip Seymour Hoffman, who was the field manager of the Oakland A's. And Art Howe would make a big point of saying, "You don't tell me what to do on the field." And Billy Beane, this enormously influential general manager, would say, "I'm not going to tell you what to do on the field." And this was in 2002, 2003.
And that was accurate.
And that was accurate. It was considered, certainly management, the general manager, the so-called front office, which if we're thinking about in modern terms or contemporary terms, because we're only talking about 2002, 2003, that also includes the analytics department and all of the influence that comes from that part. And at the top of that, of course, you have George Steinbrenner. You have the team owner who was involved to as large or small degree as he, and it's always been he, except in a very few circumstances. That person will get involved, sometimes very, like Steinbrenner, sometimes not at all. But one thing that I laughed when you talked about George Costanza as Steinbrenner, one of the things that was so controversial about George Steinbrenner was just how involved he was.
The man fires people like it was a bodily function.
Well, not just in terms of personnel, but he would famously have standoffs. Billy Martin was someone who he constantly was having arguments with and fired and rehired and several times over, because he was, in Billy Martin's opinion, interfering with his power over the team on the field. Right. It was absolutely it was considered, a manager would consider that sacrosanct.
Now, in the movie version of Moneyball, Philip Seymour Hoffman's character is openly contemptuous.
Absolutely.
Billy Bean.
Yes.
Right from the start. It isn't that he becomes Billy Bean's enemy. He's openly contemptuous of any idea of authority right from the beginning.
That's right. But he does of course make that changed. Say that again?
You're going to tell our listeners that has changed.
It has, and again, it's a change that is revolutionary, as revolutionary as any of the things that are obvious to a person watching a game. But the effect, or rather, the control that's now the control that a front office, so now we're talking about the general manager who oversees the analytics department and the scouts and all that, the sort of front office determination of just how individual games are played and how individual players are used is unprecedented in the history of baseball. But it is now becoming the norm that a field manager is not, in a lot of cases, the final decision maker on tactical decisions.
Now, why would that be? You've described field managers as having the power of God. What could possibly challenge that?
The damned accountants. So
we come back to analytics.
We come back to analytics because the pendulum has swung tremendously from sort of the old, we'll call it the old school sort of experience, instinct, tradition, in terms of how to play, in terms of tactical decisions. That has swung from sort of the old traditional way to being reliant on what the numbers say, on analytics, and what those percentages say is the better choice.
The very first thing I would think that would cause is a breakdown in command on the field. If the players know they don't have to pay attention to the guy who once had the power of God over their life, why would they pay attention at all? How would the field manager have any authority at all?
Well, so the way this works is it's still we'll keep the military metaphor. The orders still are delivered by the field manager.
But
it's just they don't originate with him
But
anymore.
If the field manager gave an order to a player that's pulling in $30 million a year, and the player didn't like it, it sounds like the current situation is one in which the player could say, well, let's see what so-and-so thinks. Well, I don't listen to you, you're just
the one thing you're missing is the player knows what so-and-so thinks, because the manager wouldn't say anything other than what so-and-so thinks, because if he did, he wouldn't have a job the next day.
So are there any old school managers, field managers, that have been willing to take that transformation and stay in the job? It must be
Glad you asked that,
humiliating
Steve.
for them.
I'm going to throw a few numbers at you, if that's okay. We're going to talk.
I love
about,
numbers.
we're going to talk about Major League Baseball managerial salaries, which are a bit of a black box because they don't have to be disclosed. Player salaries are disclosed because there are competitive requirements in terms of salary cap, not a salary cap, but luxury tax. That is information that is easy to get, player salaries. Managerial front office salaries, a lot of times are not publicly known. But I do have a list of what are the best guesses of managerial salaries from last year. And I'm just going to read off a few. Number one, so the alleged highest paid manager is Terry Francona of the Cleveland Indians. People in Boston will recognize that name. He won several World Series with the Red Sox. Considered about as good a quote baseball man as you could have in the universe. I think he's a fantastic manager. He probably has the most authority in a dugout as anyone alive. He has been pretty darn receptive enough to the new input that he's still not in Boston, but he's still the manager in Cleveland. His salary estimated last year at $4.2 million. Not a bad gig.
That's more than I make.
It is more than you make. We suspect anyway. But I will say, the best manager I think of my lifetime, and I'm biased because I'm a Yankee fan, would be Joe Torre, who was the Yankees manager for so many years in the 90s when they were winning all of their World Series. His last contract, he was making over $7 million a year.
Okay, so you're describing people who were great players and then great field managers in the old system where they had the power of God.
Well, Francona was absolutely a journeyman player, but your point is the same. Francona is one of the few who sort of bridged the gap here. He's still a manager.
So is he the old style manager? Why would someone like him
I think he's done the best job of integrating the two philosophies or the two schools.
And how would that be done? Would that be done purely personally? He knows the front office management really well?
I think he knows. I think he uses. I think the best way to use analytics, and this is more of a philosophical statement, I guess, and very general, but I think the best way to use these analytics, and they should be used, is to use them to either confirm or modify the sort of traditional judgment.
Confirm or modify.
Yeah, which oftentimes they do. But also, there's an element of being a baseball manager that I think gets overlooked by analytics departments and some, but not all general managers. And Cleveland, who still, as I said, employs Terry Francona, the quintessential sort of baseball man, they understand that a lot of being a manager is being a social worker, being a psychologist, knowing how to get performances out of these individual players in stressful environments. That's a big part of what Terry Francona does and is absolutely known for getting a lot.
In general, aside from these multimillionaires, in general terms, the field manager has a lot less autonomy, a lot less power.
Even the most powerful ones, and I would say Francona's at the top of that list, have less power than they did 10 years ago.
So, in your opinion, has that hurt the game? Or is that
I think it's contributed to a lot of the parts of the game that I don't like.
Such as?
Such as the way pitchers are different, um, fewer stolen bases, sacrifices, things that the analytics will tell you are bad. And I think they were overused in the past, but they still have a place. A good manager can, well, let's take a sacrifice bunt. It's anathema to baseball analytics to give up an out. When you're giving up an out, you're not just giving up an out, you're giving up the possibility of doing of scoring a run with that at bat. So you're not just, you're not just giving up an out, you're killing a chance to score runs. So so it's something that should be, rarely done. And I sort of agree with that, but it doesn't mean you should never do it. And a really good manager with good instincts will be able to know when this should be done and when it shouldn't.
Okay. So how strict is the front office control? Is it still
that is
on the field?
That is
still true?
That is not consistent at all.
So in a case like the one you just described, how many field managers could call for that? Could go to their player and say, "Well, that's what we're going to do."
That's not the kind of thing that's I don't think is strictly forbidden. And again, when I talk about this sort of being a black box, we don't know what those communications are. But we do know how much. We do know, at least in one measure, how valued the manager is, independent from the front office. If I can just go back to salaries for 1 second, one trend I'll say, I'll say unequivocally, is baseball manager salaries have gone down precipitously in the last 10 years. So right now, Terry Francona at $4 million is the highest paid baseball manager. Joe Torre 15 years ago was making almost twice that as the Yankees manager. The next two most highest paid managers last year, Joe Madden of the Los Angeles Angels is making $4 million, and Joe Girardi of the Philadelphia Phillies making $3.6 million. Those were the number two and three highest paid managers last year. One thing that they both have in common, they were both fired last month or this month. They are no longer managing those teams.
And you're saying those salaries represent a decrease?
An enormous decrease. Well, for a little context, so the next three highest salaries are $2.5 million, $2.5 million, $2.5 million. Then it goes down to $1.5 million. Okay.
So what is the cause of that? Is that because
the cause is
we're not going to pay you this much? We don't need you as much?
They're seen as, by and large, much more replaceable than they were, because a lot of the decisions do not originate with the manager. They're dictated by the front office.
How granular a decision? Does the field manager for a Major League Baseball team have upper management in his ear during a game?
Not quite like that, but something that's become very common with pitchers now is a pitch count or an innings count. A front office will say, you can only pitch this pitcher X number of innings this year. And once he's pitched that number of innings, he is not allowed to pitch in.
And an experienced field manager hearing that for the first time doesn't just simply say, I'll walk.
Maybe some of them did, but that's something
that's clearly a field manager's decision.
Yeah.
Okay, if Terry Francona is well off, he makes good money. What happens when he leaves that job?
He goes into broadcasting if he wants.
I don't.
Or he retires.
About him, I mean his replacement.
His replacement's probably making $800,000.
Oh my God!
If you'll indulge me for a second, I always love giving this example. If you look at the college football, your Iowa Hawkeyes. I should have looked up and found out what their head coach Kirk Ferentz makes, but I'm sure he makes
It'll
several
always be
million
Hayden
dollars
Fry.
a year. Oh, it's always Hayden Fry. So just to give some context, so the top 10 managerial salaries in Major League Baseball run from a little over 4 million down to a little over $1 million for the top 10 paid. For the top 10 in college football, they run from 10 million to 7 million for college football team, most of them public employees. I should clarify. So, and one of my favorite examples of this is the Rutgers Scarlet Knights, a woeful college football program, although now part of the, I see our countdown, although now part of the Big Ten, which now has 14 teams, because the world is insane. There's a Big Ten team in New Jersey, which is a long way from Iowa City.
Yes.
Yes. So, but his team, which over the last 2 years won 8 games and lost 14 games, his salary is $3 million a year, which makes him higher paid than all but 3 Major League Baseball managers, which is pretty astounding. And it tells you the difference in autonomy between,
I guess it does.
these coaches. And
but why would that be true? Why?
Well, there are a lot of reasons.
But statistics
for
are statistics either way. Why wouldn't the front office for Iowa care as much? It makes them
well because this type of this. Well, there are a lot of reasons. There is no front office that deals with football at Iowa. Kirk Ferentz's office, his boss is the university president, and the university president, in terms of football, only cares about what kind of revenue they're taking in, which I assume is significant. But that's one.
Yes. And I almost, thanks to Hayden Fry, back when he was in sole ironclad control of the Hawkeyes, I almost became John Wilkes Booth, because I opened the door to a hallway. I had my 10-speed bike. I rode all over campus, and I shoved the bike out the doorway. It was this concrete stairwell on the side of a building. I just shoved my bike in front of me once the door opened. I wasn't thinking anything of it. The stairwell was always empty. And it hit somebody, and I looked ahead, and it hit Hayden Fry, and he was tottering at the top of the stairs. If he had fallen, I would have been lynched that day. If he had fallen, yes. I might as well have just yelled out "Sic Semper Tyrannis." It wouldn't have mattered. I wouldn't have been able to say it was an accident.
No, you would have made a beeline for Ames and not gotten there.
Where I might have got a parade.
Yeah, right.
Well, so we're almost out of time.
Yeah.
What are you thinking for next week? Is it possible that we will migrate back to books?
I think we probably will. I'd like to migrate back to books. I do like talking about.
Well, for a minute there, we were teetering on the brink, like Hayden Fry. For a minute there, we were going into 3 more weeks of basketball this time.
No, basketball is mercifully over. I love basketball, but
no. The charge in the auditorium for a basketball game was amazing. At all the times that I've gone to Celtics games and also the Hawkeyes, and the charge was amazing. But there was really nothing to compare with the kind of Mayan religious ceremony that is football in the Midwest.
College football in the Midwest and the South. Religion. Sort of a religious revival. There certainly are tents. Tents and buses.
Tailgate parties everywhere. I used to go to the tailgate parties even when I wasn't going to go to the game because the food was so good. Yeah. I went to a tailgate party once for the Hawkeyes. Beautiful autumn day. all these wonderful, wonderful middle-aged fans in their black and gold sweaters and whatnot. And the food was great, and we were having a great time talking, and I was loving, loving up their dogs and whatnot. And they were drinking a lot. I mean, even by Iowa standards, they were drinking a lot. And finally, at one point, I said to the pater familias, I said, well, but if you keep drinking, the game isn't for another hour. If you keep drinking like this, you're going to be unconscious. And he said a classic football fan line. He said, don't need to be conscious to be a fan. I went, I thought, well, you got a point there.
we should, and in fact, it's often a detriment. And I think I wish we as a society would look a little more closely at activities where consciousness is a detriment. However,
well, so next week we'll go back to books.
We will,
because we've got a minute left.
Yeah.
Tell everybody, people who are new to this, to this team up of ours, I think we get a little bit more viewers each time. But the reason why I have a background covered in books will be known to anybody who watches this channel. But the books behind you are not your own, right? You were working at the Brattle bookshop in Boston.
No, I am in our little research nook in the basement of the Brattle bookshop in Boston, where I sell books, rare, used, and everything in between. And actually, I will go back immediately after signing off with you to doing just that.
I almost stopped by the shop today, but my little dog said no.
Well, I mean, Saturday, it's pretty tough to get you without a dog walk or outside of a dog walk's radius.
Yeah. Well, the shop is mobbed on Saturdays, which is great for the Brattle.
It's a beautiful day today. It's not humid at all. Dew point's about 51. It's perfect.
It's not so great for me. I love that there's a mob. I love that the shop's doing well, but
no, your time is 9:15 on a Tuesday when you have the place.
When it's not quite so crowded, and it's not just for not being crowded at the outdoor sale lot. Those of you who don't know what we're talking about, the Brattle is a used bookstore, and they have an outdoor sale lot with thousands of books, so you can spend your whole visit out there. And
oh yes,
it's not just a question of the carts being crowded with people, including some people who rather obviously are not readers. Oh my God, look at all these books.
An outdoor library.
It's not just that, it's also that when it's busy and crowded like that, I don't get to chat aimlessly, Grandpa Simpson style, with the staff.
Well, I mean, I sign up for doing that remotely once a week. So.
Yes, me too. That's the highlight of my visit, is to say we wore an onion on our belt, which was the style at the time. We'll research books next week.
Absolutely. I look forward to it.
All right. We'll figure out a subject matter that will enthrall. I'm just hoping we haven't habituated people to talking about baseball.
I think it'll be a smooth transition.
All right, then. I'll sign off and I'll see you then.
Take care, Steve.